It was just past 2 in the morning on December 23, 1943. In a shattered medieval town on the Adriatic coast of Italy, a Canadian sergeant from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment pressed a shaped charge of plastic explosive against the upper floor wall of an abandoned house. On the other side of that wall, in the next building, a German paratrooper of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division was watching the street below through a narrow window. He was watching for the Canadians who he knew would come. He was watching the doors. He was watching the rubble piles. He was watching the rooftops across the street. He was not watching his own bedroom wall. He had never been told to watch his own bedroom wall. Nothing in his training had prepared him for an enemy who would arrive through it. 10 months later, in October 1944, in the broken streets of an ancient German imperial city named Aachen, a colonel of the German army named Gerhard Wilk stood inside a reinforced concrete bunker on the slope of the Lousberg and listened to the sound of a 155mm American gun firing at point-blank range. One round at a time, each round entered a fortified building, then exploded. Each round was a small earthquake. Wilk would later complain to his American interrogators that the use of such a weapon at such close range was barbarous and should be outlawed. 2 cities, 2 terrors, 2 ways of taking a city held by men who had been ordered not to leave it alive. One terror moved through the walls, the other terror knocked the walls down. And the men who study urban warfare today, in the staff colleges of Fort Leavenworth, in the academies of Sandhurst, in the doctrine offices of the Israeli army, in the lecture halls of West Point, still teach both methods. They teach them in different rooms. They teach them for different purposes. But they teach them together, because together they tell the story of how a Western army learned, in 9 months of 1943 and 1944, what it costs to take a city street by street, room by room and wall by wall. This is that story. The story of how a small Canadian division in a battered Italian port pioneered a tactic so quietly devastating that it would still be taught to soldiers fighting in Mosul and Bakhmut 80 years later. And the story of how a much larger American force, in a city Hitler had declared a fortress, used a different method. A method of overwhelming firepower and disciplined combined arms that destroyed German resistance more comprehensively, but left a different kind of footprint in history. The Canadian method became the technique. The American method became the textbook. Both endured. Both worked. But only one of them inverted the geometry of fear, and only one of them made defenders dread the silence of an interior wall more than the noise of an artillery barrage. To understand why these 2 battles diverged, we must first strip away a comfortable assumption. The popular telling, especially in Canadian memory, is that the Canadians at Ortona invented something the Americans never used at Aachen. That is not true. The Americans at Aachen used wall breaching extensively. Their commanders wrote about it in after-action reports. Their doctrine manuals later codified it. The real difference is not whether wall breaching was used. The real difference is which tool was the spine of the operation, and which tool was the supplement. At Ortona, mouseholing was the spine, because the Canadians did not have the firepower to make anything else the spine. At Aachen, overwhelming firepower was the spine, because the Americans had it in industrial quantities, and mouseholing was a smaller, supplementary tool used where geometry permitted. Why this matters is simple. The terror of mouseholing came from inversion. It came from the fact that a defender, no matter how well prepared, no matter how disciplined, could not watch every interior wall in every house in every block of a city. The terror of the American firepower method came from ruin. The defender knew where the threat was. The defender knew the building was about to come down on his head. He could retreat, or he could die in the rubble. Both terrors were real, but they were different terrors, and the German voices that survive in the archive describe them very differently. We come back to that archive in a moment. First, the origin of the method. In late 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division had been fighting up the Adriatic coast of Italy for several months. They were not green troops. They had landed in Sicily in July, fought through the conquest of the island, and crossed to the Italian mainland. By early December, they were at the Moro River, 6 kilometers south of the town of Ortona. The 8th British Army, which they served under, had run into the eastern anchor of what the Germans called the Gustav Line, a defensive belt running across the narrowest part of Italy. Ortona was a working port on a plateau between 2 ravines, with sea cliffs to the north and east, and only one good road of approach. It was a natural fortress. It was held by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. Paratroopers who had jumped at Crete, fought on the Eastern Front, held the Primasole Bridge in Sicily, and were widely regarded as the finest infantry in the German army. Field Marshal Harold Alexander reportedly described them as the best German troops in Italy. Their commander on the ground in Ortona was a colonel named Ludwig Heilmann, leading the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment. The divisional commander, Lieutenant General Richard Heydrich, was on leave in Germany during the climactic days. Above them, in the chain of command, stood Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy. Kesselring did not actually want to fight a major battle for Ortona. On December 21, 1943, in a telephone exchange preserved in the 10th Army War Diary, Kesselring told General Joachim Nicholson that the Allies had made Ortona appear as important as Rome, and that the world press would soon proclaim a victory there greater than the capture of the Eternal City. Nicholson replied that the cost in blood could not be justified. Both men understood that Hitler had personally ordered the town held. Both men understood the order was a propaganda decision, not a military one. Neither man, in any surviving written exchange, expressed fear of the Canadians as soldiers. They expressed fear of the Allied newsreels. The Canadian commander was Major General Christopher Vokes of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. The brigade tasked with the urban fight was the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, under Brigadier Bertram Hofmeister. Inside the city itself, 2 battalions did the bulk of the fighting. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel James Jefferson, and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, under Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Thompson. They were supported by the Sherman tanks of C Squadron, the 3 Rivers Regiment, and the engineers of the 4th Field Company, Royal Canadian Engineers. Each battalion also had its own pioneer platoon, men trained to handle demolitions, mines, and the rough engineering of an infantry advance. Those pioneer platoons were about to become decisive. The fight for Ortona did not start in the town. It started at the Morrow River on the night of December 5 and 6, 1943, when 3 Canadian battalions made simultaneous crossings under heavy fire. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry took Villa Rogati and held it. The Seaforth Highlanders, attacking at San Leonardo, were repulsed. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment carved out a small bridgehead near the river mouth. By dawn on December 6, 2 of the 3 crossings had bridgeheads, but the cost had been severe. Then came a feature the Allied maps did not show, a 5-kilometre ravine, almost invisible from the air, cutting across the road to Ortona. The Canadians called it the Gully. From December 10 to December 18, 8 successive Canadian battalion attacks failed to take it by frontal assault. The Gully was finally outflanked by Captain Paul Triquet of the Royal 22nd Regiment, the French-speaking Vendus, with the tanks of the Ontario Regiment. Triquet captured a small cluster of farm buildings called Casa Berardi on December 14. He won the Victoria Cross for it. His verified citation records the line he gave his men when they were surrounded. "There are enemy in front of us, behind us, and on our flanks. There is only one safe place. That is on the objective." By December 20, with the Gully outflanked and the western approaches clear, the Canadians entered the southern outskirts of Ortona itself. What they found there changed the war for them. The Germans had prepared the town with patient malice. They had used controlled demolitions to collapse buildings into the side streets, creating rubble piles 10 to 15 feet high, mined and booby-trapped. The intent was to canalize the Canadians up the main road, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which the Allies called Highway 16. That main road ran straight through the heart of the city, past a series of squares. The Piazza della Vittoria at the southern entrance, the Piazza Municipale at the Civic Centre, the Piazza San Francesco, which the Seaforths christened Dead Horse Square because of a horse carcass left rotting in its centre, the Piazza Plebiscito, and the Piazza San Tommaso in front of the cathedral. Each square was a pre-registered killing zone for German machine guns and anti-tank weapons sited in the upper floors of the surrounding buildings. Doors were rigged to explode. Furniture was wired. Latrines were booby-trapped. The cathedral dome of San Tommaso was brought down during the fighting, though sources are divided over whether it fell to Canadian tank fire aimed at denying the dome as an observation post or to German demolition charges placed on the adjacent tower. The northern half of the town, where the densely packed medieval buildings shared common walls, was the killing ground the Germans wanted. They had turned the geometry of the city against the attacker. Every street the Canadians could use was a gauntlet. Within 48 hours of entering, the Canadians had a problem. Stepping into any street was an invitation to die. Clearing a building from the bottom up, by sending men through the front door, almost always cost a section. Something had to change. The man who changed it was Captain Wilmot George Longhurst, known to his men as Bill, of A Company, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. Longhurst was 30 years old, born in Lethbridge, Alberta, in 1913. He was an accountant by training. He had enlisted on the second day of the war. He was not a tactical theorist. He was an officer trying to keep his men alive. On the night of December 22, with his company stalled in front of a building near the Piazza Municipale, he came up with what would become the defining innovation of the battle. Instead of entering the next house through its door, he ordered his pioneers to blow a hole in the upper floor wall of the building they already controlled. The wall on the other side of that hole was the wall of the next house, attic to attic, because in the medieval old town the houses shared walls. The pioneers used plastic explosive shaped into a directional charge, which the men called a beehive because of its shape. They placed the charge on the upper floor party wall, the men below sheltered. The charge fired. The wall blew through into the next attic, and the storming party rushed up the stairs through smoke and dust, throwing 36 Patton Mills hand grenades, firing Thompson submachine guns and Bren guns. They cleared the upper floor. Then they cleared down, floor by floor, top to bottom, forcing the surprised defenders, who had been waiting at street level for an attack through the door, toward the cellars and the street, where the Canadians could kill or capture them. The opening they cut between rooms looked, to a Canadian rifleman, like the small hole a mouse chews in a baseboard. They called it a mouse hole. The technique they called mouseholing. The names stuck. The Loyal Edmonton War Diary recorded the slang within hours. Within a day, the Seaforth Highlanders next door were copying the technique. Within 2 days, the entire 2nd Brigade was using it. Where mouseholing was not possible, where party walls were too thick or buildings stood apart, the Three Rivers Regiment Shermans developed a 2-shot drill. An armor-piercing round at close range to punch a hole in the wall, then a high-explosive round through that same hole to finish whoever was inside. The infantry would follow through the breach. Piat projectiles, a British anti-tank weapon firing a hollow charge bomb, were also used to make initial breaches in lighter walls. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment's 8-day expenditure of ammunition tells the scale: 918 anti-tank shells, 4,050 mortar bombs of the 3-inch type, 2,000 of the 2-inch type, 57,000 rounds of .303 rifle and machine gun ammunition, 4,800 submachine gun rounds, 600 Mills hand grenades, 700 smoke grenades of the 77 pattern. Each rifleman drew between 12 and 15 grenades a day. Many of those grenades were thrown through mouse holes into rooms whose occupants had no idea their wall was about to open. The fighting that followed produced a sequence of incidents that have entered Canadian memory. On December 22, Major Jim Stone's D Company of the Loyal Edmontons gambled by not clearing every building en route up Highway 16. With Three Rivers tanks, they pushed to the south end of the Piazza Municipale, before being halted by a rubble pile and mines. On December 24, a Loyal Edmonton platoon working with Sherman's support reached a school dominating the same square. The historian Terry Kopp reconstructed what happened next. One side of the school was blasted down by a Sherman's 75mm gun, while the other tanks provided suppressing fire. Sections of infantry then entered the school and cleared it using grenades and Tommy guns. The Germans, watching all of this, learned to imitate. On December 24, at the Piazza San Francesco, the German paratroopers feigned weakness in a school building, drew in 8 to 10 Seaforths, withdrew quietly, and detonated pre-planted demolition charges. One Seaforth was found alive 3 days later. 2 days after that, on the night of December 26 and 27 near the Piazza San Tommaso, the Germans played the same trick on the Loyal Edmontons. A Canadian platoon entered a building wired with heavy explosives. The Germans waited until the building was occupied. Then they blew it. The death toll given by Toronto Public Library records is 23 Canadians killed. A single survivor was pulled from the ruins 3 days later. The Canadians retaliated by tricking a German group into another building and demolishing it. By that point, civility had left the battlefield. While the city itself was being torn open room by room, a quieter drama unfolded inside an old church. On December 21, the Seaforth Highlanders had cleared a small church called Santa Maria di Costantinopoli and were using it as battalion headquarters. By December 24, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson and his quartermaster, Captain D.B. Cameron, had decided that the men of the Seaforth Highlanders would have Christmas dinner, not in shifts back at the rear, in the church, by company, rotating in from the line. The menu, recorded in the Seaforth War Diary and in the personal diary of the regimental padre, Roy Durnford, ran as follows: soup, roast pork with apple sauce, cauliflower, mixed vegetables, mashed potatoes, gravy, Christmas pudding, mince pies. Each man received a bottle of beer, candies, cigarettes, nuts, oranges, apples, and chocolate bars. Long rows of tables were laid with white tablecloths and china. Officers served the men by tradition. Lieutenant Wilf Gildersleeve, the signals officer, played carols on the church organ for hours. A German shell had blown open the church's crypt and exposed bones. The Canadians, in Padre Durnford's phrase, were dining among the dead. The Padre's own diary records what he said as the men came in. "Well, at last I have got you all in church." Privately, in the same diary, he wrote a sentence he could not say to his men. "People are going to get killed going to that dinner, and others are going to die coming back." The Seaforth War Diary entry for December 25 read simply, "The impossible had happened." The loyal Edmontons, on the other side of the town, had no such break. Major Jim Stone's recorded recollection was characteristically blunt. "My Christmas dinner was a cold pork chop brought forward on a Bren gun carrier." The 48th Highlanders, isolated on Cemetery Ridge to the west, were resupplied through a 60-man party that brought rations, wireless batteries, ammunition, a few Brens, mortars, and rum. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Johnston, greeted the relief column with a line that has been preserved in the regiment's records. "You forgot to bring a tank." On the night of December 27 and 28, with their resupply route under threat from Canadian outflanking moves to the west, the German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division withdrew. They withdrew in good order. They withdrew under the cover of one last violent demolition. They did not break. Their division was not destroyed at Ortona. It was operationally squeezed out by maneuver, not psychologically shattered by mouseholing. By dawn on December 28, the loyal Edmontons and Seaforths discovered empty enemy positions. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry passed through and pushed out of the town's northern outskirts. Ortona was officially declared cleared on December 28, 1943. The cost was severe. Inside the town itself, across 9 days, the Canadians took 275 casualties, 104 killed. Within that, the loyal Edmonton Regiment lost 63 killed and 109 wounded. The Seaforth Highlanders lost 41 killed and 62 wounded. The Three Rivers Regiment lost 4 killed, 20 wounded, and only 2 Sherman tanks. For the wider Morro to Ortona campaign across all of December, the 1st Canadian Division suffered approximately 2,339 casualties, more than 500 killed. Nearly 4,800 personnel were evacuated for casualties, exhaustion, or illness. The Canadian Army called it the Bloody December. The German losses, recorded by the 76th Panzer Corps, ran to 455 total over the same period. 68 killed, 159 wounded, 205 missing. The Canadians counted over 100 unburied German dead in the ruins, suggesting that most of the missing had also been killed. About 1,314 Italian civilians died. Today, 1,375 Canadians lie at the Morro River War Cemetery on the cliffs south of Ortona. Almost a quarter of all Canadians who died in the entire Italian campaign. The Allied press, listening to dispatches from the Canadian war correspondent Matthew Holton of the CBC, gave Ortona its enduring nickname, Little Stalingrad. Holton's verified Christmas Eve broadcast carries the texture better than any later history. "It was not hell," he said. "It was the courtyard of hell. It was a maelstrom of noise and hot, splitting steel. The rattling of machine guns never stopped. Wounded men refused to leave. The men did not want to be relieved after 7 days and 7 nights. Major General Vokes, in his post-battle report, concluded with a line that has become inseparable from the battle. "Everything before Ortona," he wrote, "was a nursery tale." That is the Canadian half of the story. Now the American half, in a city 10 months and 700 kilometers away, where everything would be different. Aachen, in October 1944, was the first large German city assaulted by the Western Allies. Charlemagne had ruled his empire from there and was buried in its cathedral. 32 German kings had been crowned in Aachen across the medieval centuries. It was the symbolic seat of the Holy Roman Empire, what Hitler styled the First Reich. He personally declared Aachen a fortress city, to be defended to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet. The pre-war population of about 165,000 had been mostly evacuated. Fewer than 20,000 civilians remained when the city fighting began. The geography of Aachen could not be more different from Ortona. Where Ortona was a small medieval port on a peninsular plateau, Aachen was a sprawling industrial and ecclesiastical city sitting in a bowl-shaped depression dominated by the Lousberg Heights, 264 meters high. The city had been incorporated into the West Wall, the German defensive belt the Allies called the Siegfried Line, pillboxes, bunkers, dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, 2 interlocking lines, the Scharnhorst Line to the west and the stronger Schill Line to the east. Aachen could not be bypassed. It sat astride the route to the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. It was a critical road and rail hub. Eisenhower had ordered First Army to push through what he called the Aachen Gap. The American assault was assigned to the First Army of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. The 2 corps involved were the 7th Corps under Major General Lawton Collins, called Lightning Joe, and the 19th Corps under Major General Charles Corlett. The city itself would be taken by 1 division, the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, under Major General Clarence Hubner. Within that division, 1 regiment would do the urban fighting. The 26th Infantry Regiment, about 2,000 men, under Colonel John Seitz. 2 battalions of that regiment would split the city. The 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Derrill M, would sweep east to west through the centre. The 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Corley, would take the northeast factory district and then drive on Farwick Park, the Salvatorberg, and the Lausberg. To the north of the city, the 30th Infantry Division, called Old Hickory, under Major General Leland Hobbs, would attack south across the Worm River, closing the encirclement. Their attack jumped off on October 2, 1944. That date is the formal start of the battle. The German defenders inside Aachen were a different kind of force from the paratroopers at Ortona. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division held the city, 5,000 men, many of them recent recruits with fewer than 10 days of infantry training. The garrison was supplemented by 125 Aachen policemen pressed into the front line, later joined by 80 Cologne policemen who infiltrated through gaps in the encirclement. Equipment inside the city was thin, about 5 Mark IV tanks, 19 105mm howitzers, a handful of 75 and 150mm pieces, 69 artillery batteries in the sector against 86 American. Above them, in the chain of command, stood Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, and behind him Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the west. The corps commander was General of Infantry Friedrich Köchling of the 81st Corps. The garrison commander, after October 12, was Colonel Gerhard Wilk. Before Wilk, the acting garrison commander had been Colonel Maximilian Leher. There is a piece of the Aachen story that complicates the simple picture of fanatical German defense. In mid-September, before Wilk or Leher took command, the city had briefly been held by the 116th Panzer Division of Lieutenant General Gerhard Graf von Schwerin. Schwerin's division had been reduced to 600 men, 12 tanks, and no artillery. Looking at the situation, Schwerin made an extraordinary decision. He stopped the Nazi-ordered evacuation of Aachen's civilians. Then he wrote a letter, in English, to be left at the Aachen Telegraph Office for the expected American occupier. His verified words: "I have stopped the absurd evacuation of this town. I am responsible for the fate of its inhabitants, and I ask you, in the case of an occupation of your troops, to take care of the unfortunate population in a humane way." I am the last German commanding officer in the sector of Aachen. The letter never reached the Americans. The SS security police intercepted it. Hitler ordered Schwerin's arrest for treason. Field Marshals Rundstedt and Model intervened to save his life. He was reprimanded and reassigned. The episode is the single richest piece of German testimony from the entire battle. It is not about American tactics. It is about a German general who looked at the orders he had been given, looked at the civilians in his charge, and refused to participate in the destruction of his own city. That decision cost him his command. It probably saved his honor. By the time the assault on the city itself began on October 13, the man who would oversee the methodical reduction of central Aachen was not a general. He was a battalion commander. Lieutenant Colonel Derrill M of the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry. Daniel was 37 years old. He was a Citadel graduate. He had a sense of what worked. After the war, he wrote a personal experience paper for the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, which became the most important single document for understanding American urban tactics. It is the key to demolishing the popular misconception that the Americans simply stood in the streets and shelled buildings. Daniel's plan was a three-phase model: planning, organization for combat, assault. He set his intent in one sentence. The general plan was to use artillery and mortar fire across the front to isolate the sector, then to use direct fire from tanks, tank destroyers, and machine guns to pin down the defenders and chase them into cellars. Then to move in with bayonets and hand grenades to destroy or capture them. He gave his men a slogan: "Knock them all down." He explained the slogan plainly. The defenders, he said, could hardly deliver accurate fire with buildings falling about their ears. Each rifle company became a small task force: 3 tanks or tank destroyers, 2 57mm anti-tank guns, 2 extra bazooka teams, 1 flamethrower, 2 heavy machine guns. The tactical innovations were granular and brilliant. Every street intersection and prominent building was numbered and marked on mass-produced city maps with red dots. The men called them measles sheets. Any unit, anywhere, could call accurate fires by reference to a measles sheet number. Every space was searched. Every building, every room, every closet, every cellar, every manhole. The manholes were located, blocked, and weighted, because the Germans had been using the storm sewers to infiltrate behind American lines. American battalion ammunition dumps were kept moving forward continuously. Artillery firing, parallel to the front, used fuse delay shells that penetrated buildings before exploding. Daniel's verified explanation. With fuse delay, the shells would penetrate 1 or more floors before exploding, and the Germans simply would not stay in the building with that coming in. On October 13, every infantryman in his battalion was issued an extra hand grenade, all thrown over a railway embankment in unison at exactly 9:30 in the morning. About 1,000 grenades, in a single coordinated salvo just before the assault. M29 Weasel tracked carriers handled casualty evacuation through rubble because jeep tires were shredded by broken glass. And critically, here is the fact that complicates the popular telling of these two battles. Daniel's paper explicitly states that the Americans used mouseholing too. "We quickly learned," he wrote, "that in street fighting, strange to relate, one should stay out of the street. In Aachen, most of the buildings abut against each other. We blew holes through the walls to avoid going into the street in getting from house to house. We used great quantities of dynamite, beehives, and bazooka ammunition in blowing these holes." So the Americans at Aachen did mousehole. The difference between the two battles was not whether the technique was used. The difference was which tool was the spine of the operation, and which the supplement was. At Ortona, mouseholing was the spine because the Canadians had to make it the spine. At Aachen, overwhelming firepower was the spine because the Americans had it in industrial quantities. The single most distinctive American weapon at Aachen was a self-propelled gun the crews called King Kong. It was the M12 gun motor carriage, a 155mm gun mounted on a tank chassis. The official Army history records its introduction to the battle. Colonel Corley called for a self-propelled 155mm rifle. Early the next morning, the big weapon proved its worth in the first test, when with one shot it practically leveled one of the sturdy buildings. On October 18, a heavily concreted church steeple observation post that had ignored tank and tank destroyer fire was hit once by the M12 and dropped. On October 16, on Hindenburgstrasse, Daniel could not tell if a structure was a pillbox. The M12 fired about a dozen rounds. Infantry advancing afterward found a German tank, completely destroyed, inside. It was this weapon that Wilk would later complain about in his interrogation, calling its use at point-blank range barbarous and demanding it should be outlawed. The Americans had brought a corps-level howitzer down to street level and fired it through individual buildings. Nothing in German doctrine had prepared for that. On October 10, 3 Americans walked along Trierer Strasse under a white flag: First Lieutenant Cedric Lafley, First Lieutenant William Boehm, and Private Ken Cading carrying the flag. They delivered the surrender ultimatum. The city was completely surrounded. If it was not surrendered, the American Army ground and air forces would proceed ruthlessly with air and artillery bombardment to reduce it to submission. Colonel Leher, then the acting commander, rejected the ultimatum, in compliance with Hitler's last stand orders. The bombardment that followed was apocalyptic. On October 11, more than 300 fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command dropped 62 tons of bombs on the city. On October 12, 99 more tons. American artillery poured 4,871 rounds, 169 tons of shells, onto Aachen on October 11 alone. 5,000 more rounds on October 12. 80% of the city's buildings were eventually destroyed. The fight inside the city produced its own set of incidents. At the Hotel Quellenhof, a luxury spa hotel in Farwick Park that had been Wilk's initial command post, Company the 1st of the 26th Infantry took the gardens on October 14. An SS counterattack on October 15 retook them with heavy American casualties. On October 18, 2nd Lieutenant William Ratchford's platoon of K Company stormed the Quellenhof lobby. Ratchford procured machine guns and fired them down into the hotel's basement, killing 25 Germans and forcing the rest to surrender. On the second floor of the hotel, the Americans found a 20mm anti-aircraft gun that had been disassembled, carried up the stairs, and reassembled to fire down on attackers. On October 18, near Haren, Sergeant Max Thompson of the 18th Infantry conducted a one-man defense using a machine gun, a bazooka, a Browning automatic rifle, and grenades. He earned the Medal of Honor. The encirclement closed on October 16. Late that day, a patrol from F Company of the 119th Infantry, 30th Division, led by Staff Sergeant Frank Carwell, and including Privates Edward Krauss and Evan Whitis, made first contact with K Company of the 18th Infantry from the 1st Division east of Aachen. The two American columns had finally met. German relief attempts on October 15, 18 and 19 by the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and an SS battalion drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler were uncoordinated and piecemeal. By the night of October 19, German command abandoned the relief. On October 18, Rundstedt's headquarters relayed Hitler's order, the one that has become famous. Hold this venerable German city to the last man, and, if necessary, allow yourself to be buried under its ruins. The next day, Wilk issued his own order of the day. The defenders of Aachen will prepare for their last battle. We shall fight to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet, in accordance with the Führer's orders. His radio messages on October 21, his last day, read like a fading pulse. All forces are committed in the final struggle. The last defenders of Aachen are embroiled in their final battle. And then a final, almost surreal message, that the last defenders had donated 10,468 Reichsmarks to a winter charity and would fight on. Then he gave up. When the M12 was called forward to fire directly at his bunker on Rucherstrasse, Wilk attempted to send out emissaries under white flag. 2 were shot down in the confusion. He then enlisted 2 American prisoners of war held in his bunker, Staff Sergeant Ewart Paget and Private First Class James Haswell of the 1106th Engineer Combat Group, to mediate. Surrender was accepted by Brigadier General George Taylor, Assistant Division Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, at Corley's command post at 12:05 hours on October 21, 1944. Wilk's surrender speech to his men, recorded on an American Jeep and reported by 3 correspondents, deserves quotation in full because of how strikingly different it is from the Hitler salutes he had been ordered to deliver. "Dear German soldiers," he said, "I am speaking to you at a painful moment. I was forced to surrender because we ran out of ammunition, food and water. I saw further fighting was useless. I have acted against orders. I was supposed to fight to the last man. At this time I have to remind you that you are German soldiers. Please behave as such. I also wish you the best of health in your future travels, and a fast return to the fatherland after hostilities have ended. We must all return to Germany to help rebuild our country. I was refused by the Americans the authority to give a Sieg Heil or Heil Hitler, but we can still do it in our hearts. The verified last German radio transmission from inside Aachen at 12:38 hours came from the unnamed radio operator. We now sign off, with regards to our buddies and the folks back home. The arithmetic of Aachen sets up the comparison with Ortona that the documentary record actually supports. The 1st Infantry Division took about 1,350 casualties for the city assault. 150 killed, 1,200 wounded. The 26th Infantry Regiment alone, 498 casualties. Daniel's 2nd Battalion, fewer than 100 in 9 days. The 30th Infantry Division, about 3,000 casualties for the encirclement since October 2. Cumulatively, the 1st Division took 5,637 German prisoners across the entire operation, 3,473 of them surrendering with Wilk on October 21. Hold those numbers next to Ortona for a moment. At Ortona, in 9 days inside the town, the Canadians lost 104, killed for 275 total casualties, against German losses that included only a few hundred captured because the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division withdrew in good order rather than surrendering. At Aachen, in 9 days inside the city, Daniel's battalion lost fewer than 100 total casualties and accepted thousands of German prisoners. By the metric of saving attacker lives and breaking enemy resistance, the American method at Aachen actually produced a better result. So why is mouseholing the technique that endures most prominently in modern military doctrine? Why is it the technique taught at Sandhurst and Fort Benning, written into the Field Manual on Combat in Urban Terrain, and used by Israeli paratroopers at Nablus, by American Marines at Fallujah, by Ukrainian soldiers at Bakhmut? The answer is mechanism. The reason mouseholing terrifies a defender is geometric. A defender can prepare a building for an attack from the street. He can mine the doors. He can wire the windows. He can sight machine guns down the staircases. He can position grenade bundles at the front entrance. He cannot prepare every interior wall in every room of every floor for breach. He cannot watch his own bedroom wall while also watching the street. The attacker who comes through the wall comes without warning. The attacker who comes from above comes with the grenade down the stairs. The attacker has the initiative. The defender, no matter how well sighted, has lost the geometry of his own position. By contrast, the firepower method at Aachen terrifies through ruin. The defender knows where the threat is. The Sherman is in the street. The M12 is at the corner. The artillery is overhead. The defender retreats deeper into the cellar, or he dies under the rubble. There is less surprise. There is more annihilation. Both methods work. They produce different fears. This is also why the German testimony from each battle reads so differently. After the war, the United States Army systematically interrogated, captured German generals, and commissioned them to write retrospective studies. The series, called Foreign Military Studies, runs to thousands of pages. For Aachen, the German voice is rich. Kirchling wrote 8 studies. Schwerin wrote a 59-page personal account. Engel wrote 21 pages on the First Battle of Aachen. Denkert wrote on his 3rd Panzergrenadier Division. Wilk's interrogation, his order of the day, his bunker, his surrender, all of it preserved. For Ortona, the German voice is almost silent. Heydrich was captured in May 1945, severely wounded, released, and died in Hamburg in December 1947 without writing a published memoir. Heilmann survived, but his recollections concentrate on Cassino. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division war diary was largely lost. The best surviving German operational document is the 76th Panzer Corps casualty return, which Canadian historians used to estimate German losses. Apart from Kesselring's dismissive telephone call about Ortona being a propaganda trap, the German voice on the battle barely speaks at all. The Canadian narrative of mouseholing's psychological effect is therefore reconstructed largely from Allied sources and from Canadian interrogation reports of captured paratroopers. It is not unreliable, but it is asymmetric. A rigorous account must say so. What we can say with certainty is what the technique itself does to a defender, and what doctrine writers concluded from observing it. After the war, the British and Canadian armies absorbed mouseholing into their urban warfare manuals. The Americans absorbed it into theirs. Today, the United States Army Field Manual on the infantry rifle platoon and squad describes mouseholing as a standard urban tactic. The current Army Techniques publication on urban operations treats wall breaching as a fundamental close combat skill. At Hue, in 1968, American Marines used mouseholing in limited form. At Fallujah in late 2004, they used it extensively. At Mosul in 2016 and 2017, both Iraqi forces and the insurgents they fought used it. In Bakhmut and Mariupol, it returned again. The mechanism is older than Ortona, older even than Stalingrad, but Ortona was where a Western army made it the spine of an urban operation under fire. That is the doctrinal pedigree. The pedigree of Aachen is just as durable but heavier. Christopher Gabel's staff college study, called Knock Them All Down, on the reduction of Aachen, is the canonical reference for combined arms in cities. Kendall Gott's monograph on tanks in cities, called Breaking the Mold, opens with the line, from Aachen in 1944 to Fallujah in 2004. Daniel's slogan and his battalion's tactics are reproduced verbatim in current American doctrine on combat in fortified areas. Louis DeMarco's history, Concrete Hell, gives Aachen its own chapter as a foundational case. It does not give Ortona its own chapter. That is significant. The leading current synthesis of Western urban warfare, written for the modern American officer corps, treats Aachen as the foundational Western Allied urban battle. Aachen lessons fed forward into Manila in early 1945, into Hue, into Panama in 1989, into Iraq. The paradox is this: Ortona is more famous in popular culture, especially in Canada, while Aachen is more cited in formal military doctrine. The Canadian battle gave the world a small tactic that endures everywhere. The American battle gave the world a larger system that endures in textbooks. Neither replaced the other. Neither could have. They worked on different problems with different tools. Today, in Ortona, on Piazza Plebiscito, a Government of Canada plaque records that in early December 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade began their most savage battle of the Italian campaign. House to house, room to room, against resolute German defenders. 1,375 Canadians lie in the war cemetery on the cliffs to the south. The cathedral has been rebuilt. The Castello Aragonese, the medieval castle at the northern point of the town, still stands. In Aachen, on the Lousberg, Wilkes Bunker still stands too. The cathedral, where Charlemagne was buried, survived the bombardment. The hotel where Lieutenant Ratchford fired into the basement is gone. The streets where Daniel's measles sheets once carried red dots have been rebuilt around the same medieval street plan. The city was largely destroyed in October 1944. It was rebuilt by the people who lived through the ruin. It is now home to a population larger than it was when Hitler called it a fortress. The men who fought in both cities are almost all gone now. The technique they passed down is not. In Mosul in 2017, an Iraqi soldier of the counter-terrorism service blew a hole through an interior wall in the old city, threw a grenade through the hole, and entered the next room from above. He had probably never heard of Bill Longhurst of the loyal Edmonton Regiment, the captain who became a major and was killed crossing the Savio River in October 1944, 10 months after he ran out of options on a side street in Ortona and ordered his pioneers to set a charge against an upper-floor party wall. He had probably never heard of Lieutenant Colonel Derrill Daniel either, the Citadel graduate who, in 1944, wrote a paper for Fort Leavenworth, explaining how a single battalion could take a German fortress city for fewer than 100 casualties. The Iraqi soldier had simply been taught what works. What works has a lineage, even when the men who built it are forgotten. The lineage is 2 cities, 2 methods, 2 memorials, 1 craft. The craft is the oldest one in soldiering. It is the craft of getting from one room to the next, in a building that someone else does not want you to enter, without dying on the way. The Canadians at Ortona did it by going through the wall. The Americans at Aachen did it by knocking the wall down. The soldier who stands today in the rubble of a city he was not born to fight in, breathing dust, holding a charge against a wall, is in the lineage of both of them. whether he knows it or not. That is what the men who fought in 1943 and 1944 left behind. Not territory, not even victory, a craft that outlived them all.